and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. When I was 16, one of my closest friends and I were driving out to another friend's house, late one winter night. She lived outside town, probably 15 or 20 minutes away, depending on road conditions. Back then, that drive always felt a little creepy at night, even under normal circumstances. The road out there cut through long stretches of empty land with almost no streetlights. It twisted through wooded areas and sharp curves where deer constantly jumped out without warning. During the daytime, it was actually a pretty drive. But at night, it became something completely different. Just darkness, trees, and winding pavement disappearing into your headlights. That night was especially cold, too. The temperature was hovering around freezing, maybe 32 degrees or slightly lower. And I remember being nervous about black ice forming on the road, the kind you cannot really see until your tires suddenly lose traction. So I was driving carefully, both hands on the wheel, paying close attention to every curve. It was one of those quiet drives where you and your friend are talking casually 1 second, and then both fall silent for a while, just staring out into the darkness beyond the windshield. We were approaching a bend in the road when I suddenly noticed something ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer standing in the road. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The tires skidded slightly before catching again, and the car slowed hard enough that both of us lurched forward in our seats. Then the headlights fully hit whatever was standing there. It was a person, a young guy. He was standing in the opposite lane, walking slowly down the middle of the road. Even now, I can picture exactly how strange he looked. He wore a plain white t-shirt and jeans, despite the freezing weather. No jacket, no coat. Nothing that made sense for the temperature outside. His clothes looked dirty, too, though at the time I could not fully tell from the distance. He looked young, maybe 19 or 20. At first, honestly, I thought he might be hurt or stranded somehow. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he needed help. That was my first instinct. Because who walks alone down a freezing, dark road in the middle of nowhere at night? So I slowed the car almost to a stop. I remember reaching toward the window controls because I was about to crack the window open and ask if he was okay. Then he turned his head and looked directly at us. I cannot fully explain why that moment scared me so badly. It was not dramatic at first, just the way he stared. Even though the inside of our car was dark, it genuinely felt like he could see directly into my eyes. There was something horribly empty about his face. No confusion, no relief at seeing another person, no expression that looked normal at all. Then he slowly raised one hand. At first, I could not clearly see what he was holding. The road was dark and the lighting uneven. But as our headlights shifted slightly, the object caught the light. A knife, a long one, probably around 10 inches or so. I remember seeing parts of the blade reflect brightly, while other sections looked darker and duller. Like something thick was smeared across portions of it. For a second, my brain refused to fully process what I was seeing. The guy tilted his head sharply to one side, way too far, not in a normal, curious way. It looked unnatural, almost loose somehow. and then he smiled. To this day, that smile is still the scariest thing I have ever seen in my life. His mouth stretched open unnaturally wide, but the rest of his face stayed completely dead. His eyes did not change. There was no warmth or emotion in them at all. Just this horrible, empty stare fixed directly on us while he held the knife up in the headlights. My friend beside me immediately started panicking. I remember hearing her inhale sharply before she began screaming. Not words at first, just pure fear. But I was frozen, completely frozen. People always think they know how they would react in terrifying situations, but sometimes your brain just stops working for a second. Mine did. Part of me still could not understand what I was looking at. Another part of me was trying desperately to convince myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe the knife was not real. But deep down, I already knew something was horribly wrong. Then the guy took a step toward our car. Only one step, but it snapped the entire situation into reality instantly. He stopped after that single step and just stood there, holding the knife up beside his face, head still tilted sideways, smiling that awful dead smile while staring directly at us. My friend suddenly smacked my leg hard with her hand while screaming at me to drive. That was what broke me out of it. 1 second, I was frozen, staring at him, and the next adrenaline hit all at once. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, and the car shot forward. I remember the tires slipping slightly before gripping the pavement. I remember my friend crying beside me while twisting around in her seat, trying to look behind us. I remember my hands shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I thought I might lose control of the car. Neither of us spoke properly for several minutes. We just kept driving. Every shadow along the road suddenly looked dangerous. Every curve made me panic that somehow he would appear again ahead of us. Finally, we made it to our friend's house. The second we got inside, we locked every single door immediately. My friend was still hysterical and crying while trying to explain what happened to everyone else inside the house. I called the police almost right away. At first, I expected them to think we were exaggerating or overreacting. Two terrified teenage girls describing some creepy guy on a dark road at night probably sounds dramatic out of context. But the dispatcher's tone changed almost immediately when I described him, especially the knife. Before I finished explaining where we saw him, the dispatcher interrupted and said officers were already searching the area for the suspect. That word alone made my stomach drop. The suspect, meaning they already knew exactly who we had encountered. We barely slept that night. Every noise outside the house made us jump. Every passing car headlights through the windows made us panic. We kept replaying the image of him standing in the road over and over again, especially the smile. The next morning, the entire story became clear. Our local newspaper reported that a 19-year-old man had attacked his family earlier that evening. According to the article, he had stabbed his parents and sister multiple times before fleeing the house on foot. Police had spent hours searching for him through the area. Eventually, they established a perimeter only about 5 minutes away from where we encountered him and finally arrested him sometime later that night. The part that disturbed me most afterward was learning he had graduated from the same high school we attended. He was only a few years older than us. Not some mysterious drifter. Not an escaped convict from far away. Just a local guy who had completely snapped. When I think back on it now, what scares me most is how close we came to stopping fully. If I had rolled the window down, if my friend had not screamed, if she had not physically hit my leg to shock me back into reality, I honestly believe something terrible could have happened. Because looking back, that man was not trying to get help. He was hunting for something, maybe anyone. Maybe us specifically once he saw two teenage girls alone at night. And the expression on his face when he looked at us is something I still cannot forget all these years later. People talk about crazy eyes sometimes, but this was different. It felt like looking at someone whose humanity had temporarily disappeared completely. Like there was nothing behind the smile except violence. Even now, whenever I drive dark roads at night and see someone walking alone unexpectedly, my chest tightens instantly. And every once in a while, I still think about how close we were to stopping the car completely. Honestly, I think my friends saved our lives that night. I was around 17 at the time, and honestly, looking back, I was dumb, in the way a lot of 17-year-olds are dumb. Not because I wanted to put myself in danger, but because I still had that teenage confidence where you think nothing truly bad is going to happen to you. You hear scary stories about people being followed, or picked up by strangers, or disappearing on quiet roads. But they always feel like stories that happen to other people somewhere else, to someone who made a worse mistake than you would ever make. That night taught me how fast things can change. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was on a bus heading home. I do not remember exactly why I was out that late anymore. It could have been from seeing friends, maybe coming back from town. Just one of those nights where you are tired and irritated, and only thinking about getting home. The bus was mostly quiet, the way public transport feels late at night. A few people scattered around, everyone half asleep, everyone keeping to themselves. Then the bus broke down. At first, I thought it would be something quick. Maybe the driver would restart it, or another bus would come. Or we would wait a few minutes and be moving again. But after a while, it became clear that nobody was going anywhere soon. I was about 5 miles from home. At that age, 5 miles did not sound impossible. Annoying, yes. Miserable, definitely, but not impossible. I was angry more than scared. I remember thinking how unfair it was that I had paid for the bus, and now I still had to walk all the way home in the middle of the night. So I started walking. At first, the route was not too bad. I was still near suburban streets. There were houses, parked cars, street lights, and the occasional glow from someone's living room window. Even though it was late, those little signs of life made the walk feel manageable. I kept my head down, hands in my pockets, probably muttering to myself about how ridiculous the situation was. The farther I walked, though, the quieter everything became. The houses started thinning out. The streetlights became fewer. The roads widened and then narrowed again as I moved away from the suburbs and toward the country lanes closer to home. I knew the general route well enough in daylight, but at night it felt completely different. Roads that seemed harmless during the day suddenly looked endless and empty. Trees along the edges became black shapes. Hedges blocked the view on both sides. Every sound seemed louder because there was nothing else around. It was pitch black in places. Not city dark, country dark. The kind where once you move away from the last streetlight, the darkness feels thick. You can barely see where the road ends and the fields begin. Your eyes adjust a little, but not enough to feel safe. You become aware of how alone you are. Still, I kept walking. I crossed over a motorway bridge at one point. I remember the strange contrast of it. Below me, cars and lorries were rushing past with headlights, cutting through the dark. People traveling somewhere warm and safe, completely unaware that I was walking alone above them in the middle of nowhere. The sound of traffic underneath was loud for a while, almost comforting, because at least it meant other people existed nearby. Then I came off the bridge and the road went quiet again. That was when I heard a voice behind me. "Are you okay?" I froze for half a second. The voice had come from the darkness behind me, close enough to be clear. I turned slightly and realized there was a car parked behind me on the side of the road. I had walked right past it without even noticing. That detail still bothers me more than almost anything else about the night. The car had been sitting there with the engine off, and no lights on at all. No headlights. No interior light. Nothing. Just a dark shape blending into the side of the road. I had passed close enough to it that the person inside could have reached out if the window had been open at the right moment. And I had not even known it was there. A man was inside. I could not see him clearly because it was so dark. I could only make out enough to know someone was sitting in the driver's seat, watching me. He asked again if I was okay. I tried to sound casual, even though my body had suddenly gone tense. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said. "I just live around the corner." It was a terrible lie. A painfully obvious lie. There were no houses around the corner. There were barely any houses for miles at that point. I knew it as soon as the words left my mouth, and I am sure he knew it too. He did not let it go. Instead, he started offering me a lift. At first, he said it in a normal enough way, like he was just being helpful. He said he could drive me home. I told him no, I was fine. Then he offered to take me to McDonald's. That made no sense either. There was no good reason for a stranger parked in total darkness at 2 in the morning to be offering to take me anywhere. Especially not with the engine off and the lights out. I kept saying no. He kept insisting. That was the part that changed the whole feeling of the situation. A normal person offering help might ask once, maybe twice, and then accept it when someone says they are fine, but he would not stop. He kept trying different angles, like he was searching for the right thing to say to make me get in the car. "Come on, I'll give you a lift. It's late. You shouldn't be walking out here. I can take you home. I can take you to McDonald's if you want." Over and over, in different words. The more he insisted, the more I realized how wrong the whole thing was. He had been sitting there in a dark car beside an empty road in the middle of the night. Engine off, lights off, waiting. And I had walked right past him without knowing he was there. That thought made my skin crawl. I kept walking as I answered him, trying not to stop fully. I did not want to stand beside the car. I did not want to get close enough for him to grab me. I just kept repeating that I was fine, that I lived nearby, that I did not need help. Eventually, after what felt like much longer than it probably was, he started the car. The engine turning over in the silence made my stomach drop. Then he drove away. But not back the way he came. He drove in the same direction I was walking. That was when fear really settled in. Until then, part of me had been telling myself, maybe he was just a weird guy trying to be helpful in the worst possible way. Maybe he was socially awkward. Maybe he had been pulled over for some innocent reason. Maybe I was overreacting. But when he drove off in the direction I had to go, all those excuses fell apart. I suddenly imagined him stopping farther ahead, turning the lights off again and waiting for me. I imagined walking around a bend and seeing that car sitting there in the darkness. I imagined him getting out. I did not know what to do. The main road felt dangerous now, because if he was ahead, I would have to pass him again. There were no houses nearby where I could knock on a door, no open shops, no safe place to step into. My phone battery was low, and even if I called someone, I still had to explain where I was, in the middle of a dark country road. So I made a decision that seemed smart for about 5 seconds. I left the main road and took a shortcut down a country lane. I knew that lane eventually connected closer to home. During the day, it was a useful shortcut. At night, it was one of the worst choices I could have made. The moment I turned onto it, the darkness became even heavier. There were no streetlights at all. The road was narrow, with hedges and trees closing in on both sides. The kind of lane where a car could come around a corner and you would have nowhere to go except into a ditch or against the hedge. Every sound from behind me made me turn my head. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart jump. At first I told myself it was better, because at least I was off the road he had driven down. Then halfway through the lane, I realized what I had done. I had made myself even more vulnerable. On the main road, at least there was a chance another car might pass. At least there was open space. At least there was some connection to the outside world. Now, I was on a pitch-black country lane with no houses, no people, no lights, and no easy way to explain where I was if something happened. If that man knew the area and turned onto the lane after me, I would have nowhere to run. That realization hit me so hard, I almost felt sick. I stopped walking for a second and listened. Nothing. Just the wind moving through hedges and the distant hum of the motorway somewhere far behind me. Then I started running, not jogging running, full panic running. I did not care how tired I was. I did not care how stupid I looked. I just ran down that dark lane as fast as I could, my backpack bouncing, my breath burning in my throat, my legs aching almost immediately. I kept expecting headlights to appear behind me. I kept imagining the sound of a car engine crawling slowly along the lane. I did not look back. That became the one rule in my head. Do not look back. Because I knew if I looked back and saw headlights, or worse, saw someone walking behind me, I might freeze completely. So I ran. The lane seemed endless. Every bend looked like it should be the last one. But then another stretch of darkness opened in front of me. I could barely see the ground. More than once I stumbled and almost fell. My lungs hurt. My chest was tight. My mind kept repeating the same thought over and over. Get home. Just get home. Eventually, the darkness started to break slightly. I saw the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, then the shapes of houses, then familiar roads. I do not think I have ever felt relief like that in my life. By the time I reached my street, I was shaking. I got inside and locked the door immediately. Only then did I let myself fully think about what had happened. A man had been sitting in a dark car at 2 in the morning with no lights on, engine off, on an empty stretch of road. He had watched me walk past. He had spoken only after I passed him. He had insisted again and again that I get into his car. Then when I refused, he drove off in the direction I was walking. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe he really was just strange and overly persistent. But I do not believe that. Not really. Everything about it felt wrong. And the older I get, the more wrong it feels. At 17, I was mostly angry at myself afterward for being scared and for making the bad decision to take that shortcut. As an adult, I understand how close I may have come to something terrible. I understand that some people wait for exactly those kinds of moments. A young person alone, late at night, no witnesses, no lights, no way to get help quickly. That night changed the way I moved through the world. I stopped assuming that being close to home meant being safe. I stopped thinking I could talk my way out of every uncomfortable situation. And I definitely stopped walking alone down dark country roads in the middle of the night. What still scares me most is that I never saw his face clearly. I never got his license plate. I never knew who he was. For all I know, he drove around for a while and went home. Or maybe he parked farther down the road and waited, wondering where I had gone. Either way, I know one thing for sure. I should never have been walking there alone. And I should never have had to learn that lesson. From a stranger sitting silently in a dark car, waiting on the side of the road. My mother once told me a story about her grandmother that stayed with me for years afterward. I never heard it directly from my great-grandmother herself, because she passed away before I was old enough to really sit down and talk with her properly. but the way my mother told it made a huge impression on me. She was never someone who exaggerated stories or tried to make things sound scarier than they were. In fact, most of the time she rolled her eyes at ghost stories and superstitions. That is partly why this particular story always unsettled me so much. Whenever she talked about her grandmother, there was always a lot of warmth in her voice. She clearly loved and respected her deeply. She described her as kind, strong, religious, and very serious by nature. Not the sort of person who invented wild tales for attention. According to my mother, her grandmother almost never spoke about frightening things at all, which made this one memory stand out even more. The story happened when my great-grandmother was still a child. Back then, she lived in an old family house with several siblings. It was the kind of home where children were expected to entertain themselves. Most of the time, where arguments between brothers and sisters happened constantly, and where discipline from parents could be very strict compared to modern standards. Like most siblings, she and her sister fought from time to time. Usually it was probably over small, childish things. Toys, chores, hurt feelings. Who got blamed for something? The kinds of arguments children forget about an hour later. But one day, their fight became much worse than normal. According to the story, my great-grandmother became so angry at her younger sister that she decided to punish her by scaring her. Their house had an old kitchen separated from the rest of the home by a heavy door. Unlike modern kitchens that are usually bright and open, this one was apparently darker and more isolated, especially when the door was shut. The room had very little natural light, once closed off from the rest of the house. In a moment of anger, my great-grandmother locked her sister inside. At first, maybe she thought it was funny. Children can be cruel without fully understanding how deeply fear affects someone else. To a child trapped alone in darkness, every second stretches forever. Shadows stop looking normal. Small noises become terrifying. And my great-grandmother did not stop there. While her sister cried and begged to be let out, she decided to make the situation even worse by telling her something horrifying. She told her that something with green eyes was going to come and get her. That detail mattered more than anything afterward. At the time, she apparently just invented it to frighten the sister further. Children often choose random details they think sound scary. Glowing eyes, monsters in closets, faces in windows. To an adult, it sounds silly, but to another child, sitting trapped alone in darkness, those things become terrifyingly real almost immediately. Her sister became hysterical. She screamed and cried inside the dark kitchen, while my great-grandmother stood outside the door, continuing to frighten her. Eventually, their mother discovered what was happening, and she was furious. According to my mother, her great-grandmother described her own mother as extremely strict but fair. She did not tolerate cruelty between her children, especially deliberate cruelty meant to terrify someone. The moment she realized one daughter had locked the other in darkness and intentionally frightened her, she exploded with anger. She immediately let the younger girl out, and then turned her attention toward my great-grandmother. She scolded her severely, not just for locking her sister up, but for enjoying her fear. Apparently, she said something along the lines of, "If you think scaring people in the dark is funny, maybe you should learn what it feels like yourself." Then came the punishment. Instead of simply sending her to her room or smacking her, the way many parents did back then, her mother ordered her outside. The house had both a front entrance and a back entrance leading into the garden area. To get from one to the other outside, you had to walk through a narrow alleyway running beside the property. Even hearing the description later made the place sound unpleasant. One of those tight old alleys where the walls feel too close together and sound echoes strangely. the kind of place children instinctively dislike, because shadows collect there, even during daylight. At night or near dusk, it apparently became almost pitch black. My great-grandmother did not want to go, she argued, begged, tried explaining she was scared, but her mother insisted. So, eventually she stepped outside through the front door and started making her way around the house. At first, she probably tried acting brave. Children often do that after being punished. They try to convince themselves they are not actually frightened. My mother always imagined her grandmother walking quickly at first, trying not to look nervous, maybe even angry about being forced outside. But the farther she got from the front of the house, the more afraid she became. The street behind her grew quieter. The alley ahead looked darker. And somewhere in the back of her mind was the exact same fear she had just placed into her sister's head moments earlier. Something with green eyes. That idea was now trapped inside her own imagination, too. When she reached the alleyway entrance, she hesitated. According to her later retellings, the air itself suddenly felt wrong there, heavy. Still, colder than it should have been. Then she saw someone standing inside the alley. At first, she only saw the outline. A man, tall, completely motionless. He wore a dark cloak or coat that blended strangely into the shadows around him. She could never fully describe the clothing later, because she said the darkness seemed to swallow parts of him. But what terrified her instantly was not just the figure itself. It was the feeling that he had been waiting there, as though he already knew she was coming. My mother always said her grandmother described the fear that hit her at that moment as unlike anything else she experienced during childhood. Not ordinary fear. Not the fear of punishment or darkness. Something deeper. The kind of fear that freezes your entire body before your mind even catches up. The figure did not rush toward her, did not yell, did not even move much at all. He simply stood there in the alley, staring at her. Then she saw his eyes. Green, bright green. That was the detail she never forgot for the rest of her life. Only a short time earlier, she had terrified her sister by inventing a threat about something with green eyes coming in the darkness. Now here she was, standing alone in a narrow alley face to face, with a figure whose eyes were exactly the same color she had described. According to the story, she screamed immediately. Not a startled gasp, a full terrified scream. Then she turned and ran as fast as she could back toward the house. She no longer cared about being punished or appearing brave. She just wanted to get away from whatever was standing in that alley. My mother said her grandmother always described the feeling of those eyes following her while she ran. She burst back into the house, completely hysterical, crying, shaking, barely able to speak properly. At first, the adults probably assumed she was overreacting because of guilt and fear after being punished. But eventually she managed to explain what she had seen. A man in the alley, a man dressed in dark clothing, a man with green eyes. Of course, over the years, many people tried explaining the story rationally. Maybe there really had been a person passing through the alley that night. Maybe shadows distorted his appearance. Maybe guilt and fear amplified everything in her imagination. Children are especially vulnerable to suggestion. And she had already filled her own mind with terrifying images moments earlier, while threatening her sister. All of that is possible. Even my mother admitted that logically there were probably explanations. But what disturbed her was how serious her grandmother always remained whenever telling the story. She never treated it like a funny childhood misunderstanding. Never laughed afterward. Never exaggerated details dramatically. And the green eyes never changed. That detail remained identical every single time she told the story throughout her life. My mother said that even when her grandmother was elderly, she would become visibly uncomfortable talking about it. not theatrical fear, real discomfort. Like part of her still believed she had seen something waiting in that alley that night. Something connected somehow to the cruelty she had just shown her sister. As a child hearing the story from my mother, what unsettled me most was not necessarily whether the figure was supernatural or not. It was the strange feeling that the fear she created for someone else somehow turned back around onto her almost immediately. Like whatever ugliness she had thrown into the darkness came back out to meet her. That idea haunted me far more than the image of the cloaked man himself. Even now, years later, I still sometimes think about the story. Whenever I hear people say that certain places feel wrong for no clear reason. Old alleyways, narrow passages, dark corners between buildings where shadows seem heavier than they should. And honestly, whether what she saw was real or imagined almost does not matter anymore. Because for the rest of her life, my great-grandmother believed that after she locked her sister in darkness and threatened her with something that had green eyes, something stood waiting for her in the alley, with those exact same eyes staring back. My husband told me this story years ago, and even now it still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. What makes it so disturbing is not just the possibility of what happened, but how close he may have come to becoming part of something horrible without realizing it at the time. This happened when he was in his early 20s, not long after finishing college. Back then, he had become really interested in hiking and camping. He loved the outdoors and started taking longer and more difficult hiking trips whenever he had the chance. He and one of his closest college friends decided to spend several days hiking through a very popular American National Park trail. At the time, they thought of it as a normal adventure. The trail they picked was well known. Not crowded exactly, but popular enough that people regularly camped along parts of it. The kind of place where hikers pass each other during the day, exchange polite conversation, maybe compare maps or ask about trail conditions, then continue on their own way. My husband always said the first few days of the trip were beautiful. Long stretches of forest, mountain air, cold rivers cutting through the landscape. The kind of scenery that makes you forget how far away you are from normal life. During the daytime, the park felt peaceful and safe. Other hikers passed occasionally. Campsites appeared every so often. There was enough activity that you never felt completely isolated. But nighttime in places like that feels entirely different. Once darkness falls in the wilderness, your brain suddenly becomes aware of how exposed you really are. A thin piece of fabric suddenly becomes the only thing separating you from miles of empty forest. Every sound feels bigger, branches snapping in the distance, wind moving through trees, animals rustling in brush. Even experienced campers sometimes get uneasy at night because your imagination fills in every gap darkness creates. On one particular night, my husband and his friend had set up camp off the trail in a fairly standard camping area. Nothing unusual stood out about the location. They cooked dinner, talked for a while, then eventually went to sleep inside their tent. Sometime deep into the night, both of them woke up suddenly. At first, my husband did not fully understand what had woken him. Then he heard it again. Footsteps. Slow footsteps moving outside the tent, not passing by, circling them. He said that is what immediately felt wrong. Animals usually move differently. A bear or large animal crashing through the woods sounds random and heavy. This sounded deliberate. Step, step, pause, step. Like something walking carefully around the tent, studying it. The woods outside were pitch black. No moonlight, no flashlight. Nothing but darkness beyond the thin tent walls. At first, they genuinely thought it might be a bear. That was the most logical explanation. Bears were common enough in the area that hikers were warned about them regularly. So the two of them stayed quiet at first, whispering back and forth while trying to decide what to do. "My husband," said the footsteps continued circling slowly while they talked. Never rushing, never leaving, just pacing around them. At one point, the footsteps stopped completely beside the tent. That was the moment fear really set in, because even through the fabric, both of them could sense something. Standing very close outside listening, my husband said he remembers being painfully aware of how vulnerable they were. They had no weapon, no quick escape. They were deep in the woods, miles away from help. Eventually, they decided they needed to make noise and scare away whatever was outside. So they started talking loudly on purpose, not panicked screaming. More like the exaggerated, confident voices people use when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid. Then my husband had an idea. Loud enough for whoever or whatever was outside to hear clearly, he told his friend something like, "Grab the gun." The thing is, they did not actually have a gun. He just hoped the bluff might scare off a dangerous animal or person the second he said it. The footsteps stopped moving entirely. Then after a few seconds, they heard whatever had been outside begin walking away through the woods. Slowly, at first, then faster. Eventually, the sound disappeared completely into the darkness. Neither of them slept much afterward. Even once the footsteps were gone, the adrenaline stayed in their systems. Every tiny sound outside made them tense again. They kept listening for movement that never returned. When morning finally came, they crawled out of the tent, expecting maybe to see animal tracks nearby. Instead, they found footprints, human footprints, large shoe prints circling the tent. My husband said, seeing them immediately made his stomach drop. Not hiking boot prints from another camper, accidentally wandering nearby either. The tracks showed someone had deliberately walked around their tent multiple times during the night, studying it, watching them. At the time, though, they still tried rationalizing it. Maybe another hiker had been drunk or confused. Maybe somebody was trying to mess with them. It was creepy, absolutely, but they were young and trying not to overreact. Eventually, they packed up camp and continued the trip. Life moved on afterward, and honestly, my husband forgot about the entire thing for a while. Then sometime later, he saw a news report on television that changed everything. 2 women had been murdered in that same park around the exact same time period. He and his friend had been camping there. The case became major news because of how shocking it was. The women had been hiking and camping in the area when they were attacked and killed. The moment my husband heard the timeline and location, the memory of the footsteps outside the tent came rushing back instantly, especially the way whoever was outside had quietly circled them in the darkness, especially the way the footsteps disappeared. Immediately after he loudly mentioned having a gun, he became convinced that whoever had been outside their tent that night was the same person responsible for killing those women. Eventually, he even called the police tip line connected to the investigation and explained what happened. He told them about the footsteps circling their tent in the middle of the night and the large human footprints outside the next morning. But apparently, there was not enough specific information for the tip to be useful. No description, no face, no vehicle, just footsteps in darkness. Still, the experience stayed with him permanently, and honestly, hearing him tell the story years later still unsettled me deeply because of how matter-of-fact he sounded. He was never someone who exaggerated stories for drama. If anything, he usually downplayed frightening experiences. But with this story, he genuinely believes the mention of the gun may have saved their lives. The more I thought about it afterward, the scarier it became. because whoever was outside their tent did not behave like a lost camper. Normal people do not silently circle strangers' tents in the middle of the night without announcing themselves. Normal hikers do not stand motionless outside, listening in darkness. And if it really was the killer, then that means my husband and his friend may have been only seconds or minutes away from becoming victims themselves before one random bluff changed the situation. That thought is terrifying. What also disturbed me was how ordinary the evening had seemed beforehand. They were not doing anything reckless. They were experienced enough to choose a known trail and established camping area. There were other people throughout the park. It was the kind of trip thousands of people safely take every year. But sometimes danger does not announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it is just footsteps outside a tent at 2 in the morning. Slow, patient, circling in the dark while you lie awake, hoping whatever is out there decides to leave. When I was around 19 years old, there was a hiking trail just outside my town that I used to visit all the time. It was one of those places almost everyone in the area knew about. Tourists went there during the summer. Locals walked their dogs there year-round, and teenagers would sometimes hang around near the trails because it was one of the few quiet places away from traffic and neighborhoods. The trail itself cut through thick forest, with tall trees packed so closely together that even during the daytime parts of the path stayed dark and cool. If you followed the trail long enough, it eventually led out to a fish ladder by the river. The whole walk was peaceful and beautiful, especially early in the morning when there were barely any people around. Even now, years later, I still go there whenever I can. Back then, I used to hike there often with a friend of mine and her dog. Her dog absolutely loved the trails. The second we arrived, he'd start pulling ahead excitedly, sniffing every tree and darting around like he owned the forest. Most days were completely normal. We'd walk, talk about random things, stop near the water for a while, then head back before it got dark. But during that time, there were these 2 boys we started seeing pretty regularly out there. At first, they didn't seem strange at all. They looked about 13 years old, maybe 14 at most. Skinny kids. Awkward in that way teenagers often are at that age. Every single time we saw them, they were dressed in camouflage clothing from head to toe. Camouflage jackets, camouflage pants, sometimes even face paint. They always carried BB guns, too. Not real rifles, obviously, but realistic. Enough, at a quick glance, that you noticed them immediately. Usually, they'd be off in the woods, beside the trail, pretending to be soldiers. We'd hear them before we saw them sometimes, shouting military commands at each other, diving behind logs, crawling through dirt, making fake battle noises. They'd set up cans or random pieces of garbage against trees and use them for target practice. One of them would act serious while the other one laughed constantly. Honestly, it just seemed like harmless kid stuff. I remember thinking they were a little intense. Maybe a little too obsessed with the whole military fantasy thing. But nothing about them truly alarmed me back then. If anything, they reminded me of boys I had known growing up. Lots of kids played those kinds of games, especially in smaller towns where there wasn't much else to do. A few times we passed them and exchanged quick hellos. Other times they barely acknowledged us because they were too busy with whatever imaginary war they were acting out that day. One thing I do remember, though, was how serious they always seemed about it. Most kids eventually break character and laugh or get distracted. These 2 stayed locked into the game completely. One of them especially had this cold stare that made him seem older than he really was. Even when he smiled, it didn't feel warm. At the time, I brushed it off because Teenagers can be awkward and weird sometimes. Still, looking back now, there was something unsettling about the way they behaved. The forest itself probably added to the feeling, too. That trail could feel eerie sometimes, especially when it was quiet. Once you got deeper in, the sounds from town disappeared completely. No cars, no people, just wind through trees, and the sound of your shoes against dirt and gravel. Certain sections narrowed enough that thick bushes and trees closed in tightly on both sides of the path. You couldn't really see very far ahead. If someone stepped out from the woods unexpectedly, they could be right beside you before you even noticed them. The last time I ever saw those boys was during one of those quiet afternoons. It was overcast that day, the kind where the sky stays gray and heavy, but never actually rains. My friend and I were walking the trail with her dog like usual. I remember the dog seemed restless that day, constantly stopping and looking into the woods. At one point, he even growled softly at something off the path, which wasn't normal for him at all. We joked about bears, even though there usually weren't any around there. We kept walking. The trail was empty that afternoon. No tourists, no other hikers, just us. At some point, we entered one of the narrower sections of the trail where the trees grew close together. The bushes there were thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. Everything suddenly felt very quiet. Then one of the boys stepped directly out of the woods in front of us. It happened so fast it startled me immediately. 1 second, the trail was empty. Then suddenly he was there blocking the path with a BB gun raised straight toward us. Not casually either. He was aiming it directly at my friend and me. Before we could even react properly, the second boy stepped out from behind us holding his gun too. They had positioned themselves perfectly, so we were trapped between them. I remember freezing for a second, because even though I knew they were BB guns, in that moment it still triggered panic in my brain. A gun pointed at you is terrifying no matter what kind it is, especially when it happens unexpectedly in the middle of an isolated forest. My friend grabbed her dog tightly because he immediately started barking and pulling against the leash. The boys were grinning. One of them said something like, "You're our hostages now." The other one told us to get into the bushes. At first, I honestly thought they were joking around. Like maybe this was just another version of their army game, and they expected us to laugh along with it. But there was something wrong with the way they were acting. Their voices were too serious, too calm. Neither of them looked embarrassed or playful. They genuinely seemed to enjoy the fact that we were cornered. I remember my heart pounding because suddenly the situation didn't feel harmless anymore. We were alone in the woods, with 2 boys pointing realistic-looking guns at us while blocking the only path out. Even though logically I knew they were kids, something deep down told me not to treat the situation lightly. I tried to stay calm. I told them firmly to knock it off and stop pointing guns at people. I said they shouldn't be doing that and that it wasn't funny. They didn't move. One of them repeated that we needed to get into the bushes. That was the moment real fear hit me. Not overwhelming panic exactly, but the realization that these kids were testing something, pushing boundaries, wanting to see what it felt like to control people. And honestly, I think that's what scared me most afterward. They weren't laughing like normal kids playing a prank. They were watching us carefully. I suddenly decided to bluff. Trying to sound confident, I told them I knew who their parents were, and that if they didn't leave immediately, I'd tell them exactly what they were doing out there. It was a small town, so the lie sounded believable enough. For a second, neither of them reacted. Then, something shifted. You could actually see them thinking about it. Finally, one of them lowered the BB gun slightly. The other looked irritated, almost angry that the moment was ending. After a few tense seconds, they backed off into the woods without another word. My friend and I wasted absolutely no time leaving. The second we got enough distance between us and them, we walked as fast as we could, back toward the main entrance of the trail. Her dog kept looking behind us the whole way out, like he expected them to come back. I remember feeling shaky afterward, but at the same time I also felt stupid for being so scared, because technically they were just kids with BB guns. We talked about it later that night, and agreed the whole thing was creepy, but eventually life moved on. Years passed. I never saw those boys again. Eventually I forgot about them almost entirely. Then about 9 years later, I was sitting at home, watching the news, when I saw their faces again. At first, I couldn't figure out why they looked familiar. The story was everywhere across Canada, and eventually international news picked it up too. 2 young men from Vancouver Island were suspected in multiple murders after heading north. Authorities were searching across huge areas of wilderness. Photos of them kept appearing on television, online, and in newspapers. And then it suddenly hit me. Those were the boys from the trail. Older now, obviously, but unmistakably the same people. I remember feeling physically cold when I realized it. The reports said they had murdered a professor, and also a young couple from Australia, while traveling through northern Canada. From what investigators believed, there wasn't even a real motive beyond wanting to kill people. That part haunted me. Not robbery, not revenge, just killing for the sake of killing. The more details that came out, the more disturbing it became. The entire country was following the manhunt. Police searched remote wilderness areas for weeks. People across multiple provinces were terrified because nobody knew where they were heading next, or if more people would die before they were caught. And all I could think about was standing on that forest trail years earlier with those boys pointing guns at me, while demanding my friend and I go into the bushes. I kept replaying the moment in my head over and over. What if we had laughed it off and played along? What if we had listened? What if they had been just a little older? That's the scary thing about hindsight. Suddenly, moments that once seemed strange but harmless start looking completely different. I started remembering tiny details I had ignored at the time. The emotionless look in one boy's face, the way they enjoyed cornering us, the complete seriousness in their voices, the strange lack of normal childish embarrassment. Most kids pretending to be soldiers eventually snap out of it when adults confront them. These boys didn't. Even now, thinking about it makes me uncomfortable because I genuinely believe we saw something dark in them before anyone else knew what they would become. Of course, at 13 years old, nobody expects kids to grow into murderers. You don't see children playing in the woods and assume they'll someday become the subjects of an international manhunt. That's part of what disturbed me so much afterward. Evil rarely announces itself clearly in the beginning. Sometimes it just looks like awkward kids behaving strangely. Sometimes it hides behind games. Sometimes it's standing on a quiet forest trail holding a BB gun while everyone assumes it's harmless. After the bodies of the victims were found and the manhunt finally ended, authorities eventually discovered the 2 boys dead in a remote area of Manitoba. They had committed suicide before police could capture them. The entire story felt surreal. I remember staring at the television after hearing the news and feeling this horrible mix of relief and sickness. Relief that nobody else would get hurt. Sickness knowing I had crossed paths with them years earlier without realizing what they were capable of becoming. For a long time after that, I stopped hiking those trails alone. Even now, when I walk there, certain parts still make me uneasy, especially that narrow section where the bushes crowd the path. Every single time I pass through it, I remember the sudden sound of movement in the trees and one of those boys stepping out with a gun pointed straight at us. What scares me most isn't even the murders themselves anymore. It's sometimes people give warnings long before they do terrible things, but nobody recognizes them for what they are at the time. Back then, those boys just looked like kids playing war games in the woods. But looking back now, I honestly think they were already practicing something much darker. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. When I was working in the ER, there was one patient who came in one night and stayed in my mind long after my shift ended. She was a young woman, and the reason she came in did not seem too unusual at first. She had passed out unexpectedly, and when she arrived, she said she had been feeling dizzy, weak, and just not quite right for a while. In emergency medicine, that kind of thing happens all the time. People come in after fainting because they skipped meals, got dehydrated, worked too much, had low blood sugar, were dealing with stress, or had some kind of infection they did not know about yet. A lot of the time, the situation looks scary at first, but after some tests, fluids, and observation, it turns out to be something manageable. So when she first arrived, nothing about her immediately made the room feel tense. She was awake, alert, and able to speak clearly. She answered questions without confusion. She even joked a little with the nurses, the way some patients do when they are nervous, but trying to keep things light. She looked tired, and maybe a little pale, but she did not look like someone who was in serious danger. She did not look like someone who was about to receive life-changing news. Her vital signs were not perfect, but they also were not the kind that make everyone in the room suddenly move faster. She seemed like a normal young woman who had fainted and needed to be checked out. At that point, it felt like a routine case. But during the exam, someone noticed something small on the edge of her ear. It was a dark spot, tiny enough that it could have been missed if no one had looked closely. It was smaller than a dime, and at first glance, it did not seem like the most important thing in the room. When you are in the ER, you are usually looking for the obvious emergency. Chest pain, breathing trouble, bleeding, stroke symptoms, severe pain. A tiny mark on someone's ear does not always feel like the center of the story. But the doctor asked her about it. She explained, almost casually, that it was skin cancer. She had been diagnosed more than a year before. The room changed after that. It was not loud or dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. But you could feel the shift. The doctor asked if she had been receiving treatment for it, and she admitted that she had not. She knew it was serious. She was not pretending it was nothing, but she had kept putting it off. She said she wanted to go to another hospital because she was afraid they might remove part of her ear. She wanted another opinion. She wanted more time. Maybe she wanted someone to tell her there was an easier way. And then life kept happening. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The appointment never got made. That little spot had been sitting there untreated for over a year. I remember hearing that and feeling my stomach drop. A lot of people hear the word skin cancer and think it is always something simple. They think the doctor cuts it off, stitches the skin, and then the person moves on with their life. And sometimes it can be like that when it is caught early, but not always. Some types can become aggressive. Some do not wait politely. Some keep growing while the person is still hoping they have more time. The doctor ordered scans. Even then, I do not think everyone expected the results to be as bad as they were. There was still a chance that the fainting was caused by something else. Maybe dehydration, maybe low blood pressure, maybe something common. Maybe the cancer had stayed in one place. Everyone wanted that to be true. But then the scans came back. The cancer had spread. It had reached her brain. I still remember the silence after that. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, because everyone understands what it means before anyone says it out loud. Just like that, she was no longer only a young woman in the ER for dizziness and fainting. She was someone whose whole life had changed in a few minutes. Earlier that night, she probably thought she would get some tests, maybe some fluids, maybe medicine, and then go home. Instead, she found out that a tiny, untreated spot on her ear had quietly spread through her body until it reached her brain. The oncology team became involved, and then came the part that has never left me. They estimated she might have about 5 months left. 5 months. That was the part that hit the hardest. She was young. She was talking. She was aware. She looked like someone you could pass in a grocery store and never think twice about. She did not look terminally ill. She did not look like someone whose future had just been cut down to months. That is one of the most frightening things about illness. People imagine death and serious disease as something obvious. They think a person will look weak, gray, thin, or visibly broken. But sometimes they look completely normal. Sometimes they are sitting up, speaking clearly, and making small jokes with nurses. And still they are dying. I kept thinking about why she waited. Not in a judgmental way, more in a human way. Fear can do that to people. Fear of surgery, fear of bad news, fear of losing part of your body, fear of hospitals, fear of hearing a doctor say something you already suspect but do not want confirmed. She was afraid of losing part of her ear, and that fear made sense, especially for a young woman. A change to your face or body can feel huge. It can feel unfair. It can feel like something you are not ready to accept. But in the end, the thing she feared losing was small compared to what the cancer took from her. That is the cruel part. She had been afraid treatment might cost her part of her ear. Instead, waiting cost her almost everything. Cancer can grow quietly while people are trying to bargain with themselves. They tell themselves they will make the appointment next week. They tell themselves they will go when work slows down. They tell themselves it probably is not changing. They tell themselves there has to be another option. They hope that if they do not look directly at the problem, maybe it will stay the same. But disease does not wait just because a person is scared. By the time symptoms finally forced her into the hospital, the cancer had already been moving in silence for months, maybe longer. That tiny mark on her skin had become something much bigger than it looked from the outside. Even years later, I still think about her sometimes. Not because it was the bloodiest case I ever saw. It wasn't. Not because it was the loudest or most chaotic. It wasn't that either. It stayed with me because it felt so quietly tragic. It was one of those cases where you keep thinking, if only she had gone sooner, if only fear had not won for so long, if only that tiny spot had been treated before it became something impossible to control. Working in healthcare shows you a lot of horrible things, but some cases stay with you for a different reason. They are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are calm, quiet, and heartbreaking. Sometimes they remind you that life can change because of something so small you barely notice it. A little dark spot on the edge of an ear, something smaller than a coin, and underneath it, something deadly enough to reach the brain before anyone truly understood how bad it had become. That case still shakes me. This story happened to my grandfather when he was a young man living in India. He told the story many years later. But according to everyone in the family, The way he described it never changed. Even when he got older, he still spoke about that night with the same serious expression on his face. He was not the type of person who usually made up ghost stories just to scare people. In fact, most of the time he was very practical and calm. That is part of what made the story feel so unsettling whenever he told it. Back then, transportation between towns was different from what it is now. People often traveled in crowded shared vans late at night because it was cheap and common. My grandfather had been in the city that day handling some work and was returning home after dark. The van he got into already had several passengers inside. By the time everyone squeezed in, there were around 10 people riding together. It was late enough that most of the road was almost completely empty. The road itself was a simple two-lane road stretching through long deserted areas between towns. In those days, there were fewer lights, fewer buildings, and far less traffic once you got outside busy areas. My grandfather said certain parts of the journey always felt eerie after dark because there would be long stretches where there was absolutely nothing around except trees, fields, and darkness. At first, the ride was normal. Most of the passengers were quiet. Some looked half asleep, while others casually talked among themselves. The headlights from the van cut through the darkness ahead, while the driver focused on the road. Everything felt ordinary until they reached one particular deserted stretch near an old factory area. That was when someone noticed her. Far ahead on the side of the road, illuminated faintly by the van's headlights, was a woman dressed entirely in white. At first, nobody thought much of it. Seeing people walking at night was not impossible, especially in villages or rural areas. But almost immediately, something about her movements felt wrong. She was walking extremely fast, not jogging, not running, walking. But the speed at which she moved did not seem natural. My grandfather said it looked almost as if she was gliding along the road instead of walking normally. The closer the van got to her, the more uncomfortable everyone became. Even from a distance, something about her felt deeply unsettling. She was wearing a white sari, the traditional Indian clothing many women wear. Her hair appeared long and dark, but one of her hands stayed over it almost protectively, like she was trying to cover it. As the driver realized who, or what, he might be looking at, his entire behavior changed instantly. Without saying much, he pressed harder on the accelerator. The van began speeding up. That was the moment fear spread through everyone inside. According to my grandfather, some of the passengers immediately started muttering prayers under their breath. Others looked down at the floor. A few refused to even glance toward the woman again. It became obvious very quickly that several people in the van already believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. But my grandfather, despite being terrified, could not stop himself from looking. As the van finally passed the woman, he turned his head for a better look. And that is when he saw something he never forgot for the rest of his life. The woman suddenly began running after the van, not at a normal speed, at a speed no human should have been capable of. My grandfather said the image of her chasing the vehicle stayed burned into his memory forever. The white sari moving through the darkness, her hands still partly covering her hair. And then the detail that truly horrified him. Her feet were backwards. He said the moment he noticed that fear completely took over him. In many Indian legends and ghost stories, backwards feet are considered a sign that the being is not human. Stories about spirits, witches, and entities like the Diane often include that exact detail. Growing up in India, many people hear these stories from childhood. Most dismiss them as folklore or old village tales, meant to scare children. But in a moment, trapped inside a speeding van on a deserted road at night, the stories suddenly felt very real. The passengers, who noticed my grandfather looking toward her, immediately panicked. Several of them shouted at him to stop looking outside. They told him not to keep staring at her. One man reportedly yelled that, if you continue looking at her, she eventually catches up to the vehicle. And according to them, once she catches up, nobody knows what happens next. That terrified him even more. At that point, the entire van had erupted into fear. Some passengers were praying loudly. Others were hunched down in their seats, refusing to look anywhere except straight ahead. The driver kept speeding faster down the road, while gripping the steering wheel tightly. My grandfather said he could still hear people shouting at him to stop looking back. But part of him was frozen between terror and curiosity. He glanced behind one final time and claimed the woman was still chasing the van at an impossible speed, keeping pace far longer than any normal person ever could. Eventually, after several terrifying minutes, the figure disappeared back into the darkness. Nobody relaxed immediately afterward. The silence inside the van became heavy and uncomfortable. People looked shaken. Some avoided speaking entirely for a while. Even after the road became normal again, and lights from the next town appeared ahead, the fear inside the vehicle remained. My grandfather later asked the driver what exactly they had seen. The driver apparently answered very calmly, almost like he had accepted it years earlier. He explained that there had once been a factory near that deserted stretch of road. According to local stories, a woman had been raped and murdered there many years before. After her death, strange incidents supposedly began happening around the factory. Workers reportedly heard strange sounds at night. People claimed they saw figures near the road after dark. Some drivers refused to pass through the area alone. The factory eventually suffered major losses and eventually shut down completely. Locals believed the woman's spirit still wandered the road, searching for the men responsible for her death. The driver also explained something else that disturbed my grandfather deeply. He said this was not the first time passengers had seen her. Apparently, many regular travelers who frequently used that road had experienced similar encounters over the years. Some claimed to see a woman in white walking unnaturally fast along the roadside. Others reported hearing footsteps behind vehicles, even when nothing was there. A few people supposedly described the same backwards feet. Whether those stories were true or simply local legends passed around for years, my grandfather never forgot what he personally saw that night. What made the story especially frightening for him was not just the appearance of the woman itself, but the reaction of everyone else in the van. If he had been the only one afraid, maybe he could have convinced himself he imagined it. But the driver speeding up immediately, the passengers panicking, the people shouting prayers, and everyone warning him not to look back, made the situation feel terrifyingly real. Even years later, when telling the story, he always described the same feeling he had that night: pure fear. Not the kind of fear you get from horror movies or ghost stories around a campfire, but the kind that settles deep into your stomach when every instinct tells you something is very wrong. He admitted that for a long time afterward, he avoided traveling that road at night whenever possible. And honestly, I probably would too. The image itself is disturbing enough. A deserted road in rural India, darkness stretching for miles. A shared van speeding through the night, while a woman dressed in white runs behind it, faster than any human should be able to move. But somehow, the detail that always stayed with me most was the backwards feet. Because according to my grandfather, that was the exact moment he realized whatever was chasing them was not human. My mother grew up in an area called Chicken Alley in Wisconsin, a place that a lot of locals considered haunted. long before she was born. Even now, people around there still tell strange stories about the area. Old houses, dark streets, unexplained sounds at night, shadow figures, strange feelings in certain buildings. Whether someone believes in ghosts or not, Chicken Alley had a reputation that made people uneasy. My mom grew up hearing stories about it from neighbors and older relatives. But when she was young, she and her sisters mostly treated those stories like creepy entertainment. Kids do that sometimes. You hear adults talk about haunted places, but it does not feel real until something happens directly to you. At the time, my mother lived there, with my grandparents and her sisters in an older house that creaked constantly. From the way she described it, the house always felt unsettling after dark. Not terrifying exactly, but uncomfortable. The kind of place where every sound seemed louder at night. Floorboards creaked, even when nobody walked on them. Pipes made noises in the walls. The stairs groaned under the slightest pressure. During the daytime, it felt like a normal family home. But at night, it changed completely. One evening, my grandparents went out on a date and left the girls home alone. Back then, that was pretty normal. Parents did not hover over their kids the way many do now. As long as the older siblings were there and the doors stayed locked, it was considered fine for children to spend a few hours alone in the house. My mother and her sisters were upstairs in the bedroom they shared, playing games and talking like they normally did. At first, everything felt completely normal. They were laughing, messing around, and enjoying the rare chance to stay up a little later while their parents were out. At some point, one of my aunts decided to go downstairs to get a glass of milk. The kitchen was downstairs near the staircase, and according to my mother, the downstairs area always felt darker than the rest of the house at night. My aunt poured herself the milk and sat near the bottom of the stairs, drinking it quietly. That was when she suddenly felt someone walk past her. Not heard, felt. She later described it like the unmistakable sensation of a person moving closely beside you. The shift in air, the awareness of movement, the feeling that someone had just passed within inches of her body. Naturally, she looked up, expecting to see one of her sisters. But there was nobody there. The hallway was empty. The staircase was empty. No sound, nothing. That alone scared her enough that she immediately rushed back upstairs to the bedroom. She told my mother and the others what happened. But at first, they probably tried to brush it off the way kids do. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe she scared herself, sitting downstairs alone in the dark. Still, after she came back upstairs, they shut the bedroom door. Not long after that, they started hearing footsteps. At first, it sounded like someone slowly walking up the stairs. Then the footsteps would move down the hallway. They would stop outside the bedroom door for a few seconds, then continue away again. A few moments later, the same thing would happen again. Up the stairs, down the hallway, pause outside the door, then walk away, over and over. At first, the girls assumed maybe someone had broken into the house, or maybe one of their parents had come home early. But every time they listened carefully, the sounds never fully made sense. They never heard voices, never heard doors opening downstairs, never heard anything except footsteps pacing through the hallway. The more time passed, the more frightened they became. My mother said the worst part was the repetition. The footsteps kept returning again and again for hours. Imagine being a child sitting in a bedroom late at night, hearing someone pacing outside your door endlessly while knowing your parents are not home yet. Every creak in the hallway would have made their fear worse. Every pause outside the door probably felt unbearable. Then things got much worse. Eventually, whatever was outside the room started banging on the door. Not soft knocks, banging. Loud enough to terrify all of them instantly. My mother said the banging kept happening repeatedly. getting louder and more aggressive each time. At that point, all the girls were completely panicked. They were convinced something was outside the room trying to get in. As children, they did the only thing they could think of. They pushed the dresser in front of the bedroom door to block it. I always picture how terrifying that scene must have been. Several frightened little girls struggling to move a heavy dresser while crying and listening to loud banging on the other side of the door. They probably believed with absolute certainty that if the door opened, something horrible would happen. And then suddenly, after all that noise, everything went silent. No footsteps, no banging, nothing. That silence probably scared them, almost as much as the sounds themselves. According to my mother, they stayed terrified inside that room for what felt like forever. Every little sound in the house made them jump. They were too afraid to move the dresser or even approach the door. Finally, about an hour later, my grandparents returned home from their date. They tried opening the bedroom door, but could not because of the dresser pushed against it. My grandparents apparently had to yell through the door, asking what in the world the girls were doing, and telling them to move the furniture away. When the girls finally opened the door, they were hysterical and immediately started explaining everything they had heard that night. My grandparents checked the house, but of course, there was nobody there. No broken windows, no unlocked doors, no signs anyone had entered the home at all. That story stayed in my family for decades. But strangely, according to my mom, that was not the end of weird experiences connected to our family. Around 37 years later, my mother brought my brothers and some cousins to speak with a priest at a church. I remember hearing later that the priest supposedly believed our family attracted paranormal activity. Even saying that out loud sounds strange, but apparently after hearing stories from different family members, he thought there was some kind of pattern around us. And honestly, weird experiences did not stop with the older generations. I started seeing things myself growing up, not constantly, but enough that it deeply unsettled me. Sometimes I would catch movement in places where nothing should have been. Other times I would think I saw figures standing somewhere only for them to disappear when I focused directly on them. Occasionally, I would feel like someone was watching me even when I was alone. For a long time, people naturally questioned whether there might be a medical explanation. That is the first thing most rational people would think. And honestly, I agree with that approach. Mental health conditions can absolutely cause people to see or hear things that are not there. But according to doctors, I do not have schizophrenia. That answer honestly made things feel stranger, not better. Because if there is no medical explanation, then what exactly have I been seeing? I still do not claim to know. Part of me tries to stay skeptical, because I know how easily fear and stories can affect people. Especially when you grow up hearing about haunted places and paranormal encounters from childhood. The human mind is powerful. It can make ordinary things feel terrifying under the right circumstances. But another part of me cannot ignore the experiences my family has had over the years, especially my mother's story. What makes it frightening to me is not just the idea of ghosts or spirits. It is how real the fear sounded whenever she described that night. Even decades later, she still talked about it seriously. She never laughed while telling it, never exaggerated it into some dramatic horror movie scene. She simply described hearing footsteps, pacing outside the bedroom door for hours, while she and her sisters sat trapped inside, terrified. And honestly, that calm seriousness makes the story feel even creepier. Because whatever happened, that night in that old house on Chicken Alley stayed with her for the rest of her life. And maybe in some strange way, it stayed with the rest of us too. This happened sometime around 1985 or 1986, back when I was around 11 or 12 years old. At that age, life still felt very simple to me. Most days were about school, riding bikes, watching TV, and visiting family friends without really thinking too deeply about the adult world around us. Looking back now, I realize how sheltered I was from serious problems. Adults argued sometimes, people got stressed, marriages struggled, but as a kid, you rarely understood what was happening underneath the surface. You mostly noticed the little things. The food people served when you visited, the smell of their house, the sound of their laugh, the strange decorations they owned. That was the kind of stuff that stayed in your mind. My mom had a very close friend who lived not too far from us with her husband and their 2 children. Their kids were around the same age as me, so our families spent a lot of time together. Sometimes they came over to our house for dinner, and other times we visited theirs. Back then, it felt normal for families to spend entire evenings together. The adults would sit in the living room drinking tea or coffee while talking for hours about work, money, relatives, or neighborhood gossip. Meanwhile, the kids would disappear into another room, play games, watch television, or just mess around until someone called us for food. Their house always had a warm feeling to it. I remember the carpets, the old furniture, the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with dinner, cooking in the kitchen. It felt lived in, comfortable, safe at least to me as a child. The husband seemed like a decent enough man. He worked as a mechanic and was the kind of guy who always smelled faintly of oil and gasoline. He was good with cars and always seemed to have grease under his fingernails, no matter how much he washed his hands. My dad liked him a lot because they both loved talking about engines and cars for hours. At one point, the husband sold my dad a 1978 Audi 80 GT that he had worked on himself. He had modified it and fixed it up to make it faster and better than standard. Back then, I thought it was the coolest car in the world. I absolutely loved that car. I still remember sitting inside it, looking at the dashboard, loving the smell of the seats and the sound the engine made. To me, it felt like a race car, even though it probably wasn't anything special compared to modern cars now. But when you are a kid, small things become magical. I thought the man was incredibly talented because he could take something ordinary and turn it into something exciting. Nothing about him ever made me uncomfortable. Nothing about him made me think he was dangerous. He just seemed quiet, practical, and normal. But there was one thing in their house that always fascinated me. Hanging above the fireplace in their living room was an old antique shotgun. I had never seen a real gun before in my life. Not up close, anyway. In the UK, guns were not something kids normally saw lying around. So the moment I noticed it, I became obsessed with looking at it whenever we visited. It looked old and dark, almost like something from another century. I remember staring at the wooden stock and the long metal barrel while trying to imagine who might have owned it years earlier. In my mind, it felt more like a museum object than a weapon. Sometimes, while the adults talked, I would quietly glance up at it again and again. I do not even know why it interested me so much. Maybe because it looked mysterious. Maybe because it was the only real gun I had ever seen. Maybe because kids are naturally curious about things they do not fully understand. I never touched it. I just stared at it. Looking back now, it feels strange. Thinking about how harmless it seemed sitting there above the fireplace, like a decoration. Just another object in the house. Something everyone had probably stopped noticing years earlier. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was at home with my mom when the local news came on television. I honestly was not paying much attention at first. News programs bored me as a kid. It was usually politics, weather, traffic, or stories. I did not understand or care about. I was probably half distracted by something else in the room, when suddenly my mom let out this horrible gasp. I can still hear it clearly in my head. Oh my God, no. The way she said it instantly made me look at the television. And then I heard the names. My mom's friend had been found murdered. At first, I did not fully process what I was hearing. When you are young, words like murder do not feel real immediately. They sound like something from movies or crime dramas, not something connected to people you know personally. I remember staring at the television while my mom covered her mouth in shock. The details slowly started becoming clearer. Apparently, the couple had been having serious marriage problems. I had no idea. None at all. As a child, I never noticed tension between them. If arguments happened, they hid them well whenever visitors were around. Looking back now, maybe there were signs. Adults noticed that I completely missed. Maybe there were awkward silences or strange looks. But to me, they just seemed like another normal family. The wife had apparently gone to stay somewhere nearby for a while to get some space from her husband. But he found out where she was staying. And then he went there, carrying that antique shotgun. Except it was no longer just an antique decoration, hanging harmlessly above the fireplace. He had sawn it off. I remember hearing that detail and feeling physically cold. Even now, decades later, that detail still disturbs me more than almost anything else. I instantly pictured the exact gun I used to stare at during visits to their house. The same gun hanging above the fireplace, while we drank tea and watched television. The same gun I thought looked old and harmless. He used it to kill his wife. Then he turned it on himself. I do not remember much else from that day, because everything after that felt strange and heavy. My mom cried a lot. The atmosphere in our house completely changed. Adults spoke quietly for days afterward. Whenever I entered the room while my parents discussed it, conversations would suddenly stop. At that age, it was probably the first time I truly understood that adults could hide terrifying things behind normal smiles and ordinary routines. One week, you are sitting in someone's living room, laughing and drinking tea. The next week, they are dead. And not from illness or an accident, but from something violent and horrifying that had clearly been building quietly in the background, while everyone else carried on normally. The part that haunted me most afterward was thinking about the children. I never saw them again after that. One day they were just part of our lives, kids I played with during family visits, and then suddenly they were gone forever. I later heard they had moved away to live with relatives in another country. Back then, families handled tragedy differently. There was no social media, no updates, no easy way to stay connected. People disappeared from your life completely sometimes. I often wondered what happened to them. I wondered how they processed something so terrible at such a young age. Losing both parents in one night is horrifying enough, but knowing one parent killed the other first adds another layer of trauma that most people cannot even imagine. As a child myself, I could not fully understand the emotional damage it must have caused them. I still think about them occasionally, even now. Sometimes random objects bring the memory back unexpectedly. Seeing an old shotgun in a movie, hearing about domestic violence cases on the news, seeing an old Audi driving down the road. Strange little things can suddenly drag old memories back to the surface. What stays with me most is how ordinary everything seemed before it happened. That is the unsettling part. People often imagine dangerous individuals as obviously unstable or threatening, but real life is rarely that simple. Sometimes they are just the quiet mechanic who fixes cars and chats with your dad over tea. Sometimes they are the husband sitting calmly in the living room, while a shotgun hangs above the fireplace like a harmless decoration. As a child, I thought of that gun almost like a historical object. something interesting to look at. I never imagined it would eventually become part of something so horrifying. But that is how certain memories change over time. An object that once seemed fascinating becomes tied forever to tragedy. A house that once felt warm and safe becomes uncomfortable to remember. And a family that once seemed completely ordinary becomes the center of one of the darkest memories from your childhood. Even now, after all these years, I can still picture that living room perfectly. The fireplace, the conversations, the old shotgun hanging silently on the wall while all of us sat underneath it, completely unaware of what would eventually happen. At the time, it was just another afternoon visiting family friends. None of us knew we were sitting inside a tragedy that had not happened yet. I have a coworker whose family has one of those histories people only talk about quietly after enough time has passed. Even now, nobody really discusses it openly around town because older people still remember parts of it. And in small rural areas, stories like that never fully disappear. Somebody always knows somebody connected to it. Somebody always remembers hearing rumors growing up. From what my coworker told me, either his dad or his uncle, I honestly cannot remember which one anymore, was apparently a seriously dangerous man back in the 70s. Not just some small-time criminal either. According to local stories, he was deeply involved in the drug trade around our area of the rural South and had enough influence that people were genuinely afraid of crossing him. And honestly, hearing the stories, I can understand why. Back then, he supposedly owned a machine shop way out in the middle of nowhere on this massive piece of rural property. The kind of land you only reach by driving down endless dirt roads surrounded by woods and fields where nobody would hear anything if something bad happened. Those old southern back roads can feel isolated even during daytime. At night, they feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. Apparently, the machine shop looked ordinary enough from the outside. But according to my coworker, it was being used for all kinds of illegal activity behind the scenes. Stolen machinery would get hidden out there. Drugs got moved through the property. People came and went at strange hours. And because it sat so far away from town, almost nobody asked questions. Or maybe they were too scared to ask. The creepiest part of the whole story was what supposedly happened to people who caused problems for him. According to my coworker, there were several incidents involving people getting into altercations over drugs, money, or betrayal. And back then, especially in isolated rural areas, things could disappear quietly in ways that sound unbelievable today. He told me that when certain people crossed his relative, they simply vanished. No big investigations, no dramatic manhunts, just gone. And according to family rumors, some of those missing people never actually left the property at all. They were supposedly shot, thrown into their cars, and buried somewhere out on the land itself. That detail honestly bothered me for days after hearing it, because the property still exists, and I have actually been there. Not recently, but years ago, before I knew any of these stories, I ended up out there once through mutual acquaintances. At the time, it just seemed like old rural land with rusted equipment, overgrown paths, and abandoned junk sitting everywhere. But afterward, once I heard the stories, my memory of the place changed completely. Because suddenly every collapsed shed and overgrown patch of dirt started feeling different in my mind. My coworker swears there are still old buried cars somewhere out on that property containing bodies from the 60s and 70s. Now, whether that part is literally true or just local legend, I honestly do not know. But what unsettles me is that the property is absolutely large and isolated enough that something like that feels possible. That is the terrifying thing about huge stretches of rural land. Things can disappear there forever. People who grow up in cities sometimes do not understand how empty some parts of the rural South can feel. Miles of woods, fields, dirt roads with no houses nearby. Places where headlights become the only visible thing at night. If someone buried something deep enough on private land decades ago, there is a very real chance nobody would ever find it. And honestly, old southern towns are full of stories like that. Drug runners, moonshiners, violent feuds, people disappearing after arguments. Most of it exists somewhere between rumor and truth now, because so many years have passed. But sometimes you hear enough details from enough older locals that you start realizing at least some of those stories probably happened exactly the way people claim. The strange thing is that despite how creepy those stories are, they still somehow feel grounded in reality. The next story, though, that one still genuinely unsettles me because I experienced it myself. A few years ago, me and my dad were driving home late one night after a Walmart run. It was one of those completely ordinary evenings that suddenly turns strange for no reason. We were taking an old country road home, the kind with almost no streetlights anywhere. On one side, there was a farm stretching into darkness, and on the other side were rows and rows of orange trees, disappearing endlessly into the night. It was quiet, except for the sound of the truck and insects outside. I remember staring out the passenger side window while we drove. Because rural roads at night always put me into this weird, thoughtful mood. The headlights only illuminate small pieces of the world at a time, and everything outside that beam feels hidden somehow. Then I saw someone standing beside the road. At first, my brain processed it completely normally, just a person standing there. But as we passed closer, something immediately felt wrong. The figure stood maybe 3 feet from my window as we drove by, and I could almost see through it. That is honestly the best way I can describe it even now. It looked vaguely human, but not solid. Almost like it was made out of spider webs, or smoke, or thin strands of fog shaped into a person. Pale and strange and barely there. I could see the orange groves faintly through parts of it. And yet somehow it still looked undeniably human. I remember every hair on my body standing up instantly. The whole sight lasted maybe 1 second as the truck passed, but the image burned into my brain immediately. My heart started racing because my mind could not figure out what I had just seen. At first I sat there silently, trying to rationalize it. Maybe fog, maybe light reflection, maybe somebody wearing weird clothing. But none of those explanations felt right. Finally, trying to break the tension, I half-jokingly told my dad, "I think I just saw a ghost." And the second I looked at him, my stomach dropped, because his eyes were wide, really wide. And he immediately asked, "You saw it too?" That response scared me far more than the figure itself, because if it had only been me, I probably could have eventually convinced myself it was some weird lighting effect or imagination. But hearing my dad say he saw it too completely changed everything. Without even really discussing it, we ended up turning around to go back. Part of us genuinely wanted to debunk what happened. We drove slowly past the area again, trying to recreate the exact angle and lighting conditions. We checked for road signs, reflective objects, fence posts, anything that could have produced some strange illusion in the headlights. There was nothing there. No signs, no people. Nothing remotely shaped like what we saw. Just empty roadside beside endless rows of orange trees. The whole drive home afterward felt tense and strange. Later, I told my grandpa about it, mostly expecting him to laugh at us. Instead, he got weirdly quiet. Then he told me that many years earlier, according to local stories, a man had supposedly been hanged somewhere along that same stretch of road for messing around with another man's wife. Now, obviously, I have no idea whether that part is true or just old folklore attached to the area over time. Rural communities love attaching ghost stories to tragic places. But hearing that, after what me and my dad both saw, definitely did not make me feel better. Even now, I still cannot explain it properly. Maybe it was some weird visual effect. Maybe our brains both misinterpreted the same thing at once. Or maybe not. I honestly do not know. But the third story is the one that genuinely disturbed me most, because there was absolutely no dramatic setup beforehand. No creepy road, no dark legends, just an ordinary house on an ordinary day. A few years ago, I was dating a girl whose family lived together in a pretty normal suburban home. Her parents were nice people. Her little brother was maybe around elementary school age. And nothing about the house itself felt creepy. I had been over there many times before. One day, I was inside the house looking for my girlfriend because everybody seemed scattered around doing different things. I walked through the hallway calling her name and eventually saw someone quickly move into her little brother's bedroom. I assumed immediately that it was her trying to mess with me. That was honestly my first thought. So I jokingly called out something like, "Quit screwing around. You're not going to scare me." Then I walked toward the room. I remember seeing movement disappear inside just seconds earlier. But when I stepped into the bedroom, it was completely empty. No girlfriend, no little brother, nothing. The room itself looked perfectly normal, except for one detail that instantly made me uncomfortable. The closet door was slightly cracked open, not wide open, just enough to create that horrible feeling that somebody could be standing behind it, watching you. Now, normally, I would have just assumed somebody slipped past me somehow, except the entire house was quiet. And when I walked back outside, I realized every single member of the family was already outdoors. My girlfriend, her parents, her little brother, all outside together. I remember immediately feeling cold all over, because I knew with complete certainty that I had just seen someone walk into that room. Not maybe, not thought I saw. I saw movement clearly enough that I spoke to it. Later, I quietly pulled my girlfriend aside and told her what happened. The second I mentioned it, her expression changed immediately. Then her mom overheard us and quickly told me not to mention it around the little brother because they did not want to scare him. That response honestly disturbed me more than the sight itself because it meant they already knew. Apparently, multiple people in the family had experienced strange things connected to that room before. Not dramatic haunting movie stuff, just sightings, movement, the feeling somebody was there. Seeing figures briefly when nobody else was inside, and they had intentionally kept it from the younger brother, so he would not become terrified sleeping there. That conversation completely changed how I felt inside the house afterward. Every ordinary sound suddenly felt heavier. Every hallway seemed darker. And once you know multiple people independently experienced something strange in the same room, your brain starts noticing every little detail. I hated walking past that bedroom afterward, especially at night, because once your mind accepts the possibility that you might have actually seen something impossible, even briefly ordinary spaces stop feeling completely ordinary anymore. And honestly, that is what unsettles me most about all three of these stories. Not necessarily whether ghosts are real or not, but the fact that sometimes people experience things they genuinely cannot explain. A property possibly hiding buried secrets from decades ago. A transparent figure standing beside a dark country road. A person walking into an empty bedroom. Maybe every single one has a rational explanation. Or maybe some places and moments simply leave strange marks behind that we do not fully understand. A few years ago, me and some friends decided it would be a good idea to explore an abandoned bunker outside our town. At the time, it felt exciting more than scary. We were young, bored, and always looking for places that felt forbidden or hidden. Old abandoned buildings have this strange pull when you are a teenager. The more dangerous or creepy a place looks, the more everybody wants to go inside. The bunker had been sitting abandoned for years from what we heard. Nobody seemed to know exactly why it was built originally. Some people said it was military. Others claimed it was some kind of storage shelter from decades ago. Like most abandoned places, every person had a different story about it. What everybody agreed on, though, was that the place felt wrong, even during daytime. It sat partially underground, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken concrete. Trees crowded around parts of the entrance, and the air nearby always felt colder somehow. The entrance itself looked like a giant cracked mouth, disappearing into darkness. Of course, that only made us more interested. We arrived there late in the evening, when the sky was already getting dark. Looking back now, that was probably stupid. Exploring abandoned underground structures at night is already dangerous enough, without adding darkness to the situation. But at the time, we were laughing and trying to scare each other, more than actually thinking clearly. There were maybe 6 or 7 of us all together. Some people were pretending to act brave, while others were already nervous before we even entered. You could feel that weird, excited tension everybody gets before doing something creepy. The inside of the bunker smelled terrible. The second we stepped through the entrance, the air changed completely. Cold, damp, heavy air hit us immediately. It smelled like mold, wet concrete, dirt, and standing water that had been trapped underground forever. Every sound echoed too. Even small movements bounced strangely through the corridors. Footsteps sounded louder than they should have. Water dripped somewhere deep inside the structure, creating random echoes that made it impossible to tell where noises were coming from. The bunker itself was basically one long corridor stretching forward into darkness. Along both sides were rooms with broken doors or empty openings leading inside. Most of the rooms were pitch black beyond a few feet. And the farther you looked down the corridor, the darker everything became. Some of us immediately decided we did not want to go too far inside. 2 of the guys, though, were acting fearless. They both wore white t-shirts, which is important because that detail became burned into my memory afterward. They joked around, called the rest of us cowards, and started walking deeper into the bunker, while the rest of us stayed closer to the entrance area. At first, we could still hear them laughing and talking. Then gradually, their voices faded farther away. Eventually, everything became quiet again, except for dripping water and echoes. We waited around for a while, joking nervously with each other. But after some time passed, we started wondering why they had been gone so long. It is hard to explain how time feels inside places like that. 5 minutes starts feeling much longer because there is nothing to focus on except darkness and strange sounds. One of my friends finally shouted down the corridor asking where they were. No answer. Then somebody else called out louder. Still nothing. That was when the atmosphere started changing. The joking mostly stopped. We all stood there, staring into the darkness of the corridor, trying to listen for movement. And then we saw it. Farther down the corridor, a white figure stepped briefly into view. At first, I honestly felt relieved because I assumed it was obviously one of our friends. The white t-shirt stood out clearly against the darkness. But something about the movement immediately felt strange. The figure did not respond when we called out. It just slowly walked across the corridor and disappeared into one of the side rooms. We shouted again. Still nothing. A few seconds later, the figure appeared farther down again. Not running, not joking around, just moving silently from room to room. That was when I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. There is something deeply wrong about seeing human movement, with no sound attached to it in a place like that. No footsteps, no voice, nothing. Just this pale shape moving in silence through darkness. Some of my friends started yelling louder, thinking the guys were trying to scare us. I picked up rocks from the floor and started throwing them down the corridor, while calling for them to stop messing around. The strange thing was that the figure never reacted naturally. No flinching, no laughing, nothing. It would appear briefly, then disappear into another room, then appear again farther away. The entire time several of us could clearly see it. That is what still bothers me most. It was not just one person imagining something. Multiple people saw the exact same figure moving down there. At some point, I remember getting angry more than scared, because I thought our friends were dragging the joke out too long. I shouted something at them again, while another rock bounced loudly off the concrete wall. And then suddenly, at almost the exact same moment, we heard voices behind us. We turned around, and there were the two guys in white t-shirts, standing near the entrance behind us. I still remember the feeling that hit my stomach in that moment. Pure confusion first, then fear immediately after, because we had just spent several minutes watching what we thought was one of them moving through the corridor deeper inside the bunker. But both of them were suddenly outside the direction we had been looking the entire time. Everyone started talking at once. We asked where the hell they came from. They looked confused too, and explained that deeper inside the bunker, they had found another exit leading outside. Apparently, they had not even stayed underground very long, because the place creeped them out too. That explanation should have made everything feel better. Except for one problem. If they had already left through another exit, then who or what had we been watching moving through the corridor? To this day, I still cannot explain it properly. And honestly, I have tried. Maybe shadows were distorting somehow. Maybe there was another person inside the bunker. Maybe our brains misinterpreted shapes in the darkness because we expected to see our friends. But what bothers me is how clearly multiple people saw the same thing. Not just one quick glimpse either. We watched it move several times. White shape, silent movement, room to room. And every single one of us believed it was one of the guys until they suddenly appeared behind us. After that, nobody wanted to stay there anymore. The mood completely changed. The excitement disappeared instantly. We left the bunker pretty fast after that, and the whole walk back outside felt tense and quiet. Nobody even joked much anymore. I remember constantly looking over my shoulder toward the bunker entrance while we walked away. It felt like something might appear there, watching us leave. And honestly, abandoned underground places already mess with your mind badly, even without strange experiences. There is something deeply unsettling about long, dark corridors underground. Your senses stop working normally. Sound echoes strangely. Shadows move differently. Distances become hard to judge. Your brain starts filling gaps automatically. Maybe that is all it was. Maybe we scared ourselves. But even years later, whenever me and those friends talk about that night, everybody still describes the same thing. A white figure silently moving through rooms deep inside the bunker. And the fact that our friends appeared from behind us instead of from the corridor still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. Because for at least several minutes, we were absolutely convinced someone was still down there watching us. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.